Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and this time we are doing a graphics comparison and analysis of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond versus Metroid Prime Remastered, which for many is considered to be the best looking game on Nintendo Switch, except maybe until now with Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. Now with what we're going to be doing today, most of it will have been scripted by Brandon, so I'll be putting his social media in the description below, make sure to show him some love, but throughout I'll be going through his analysis while adding a few little things of my own. But basically, we think Metroid Prime 4 Beyond looks really good. Now before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Going over the differences here, the most obvious initial one is the ship. What we're looking at here is a much different design compared to the ship in Prime 1 Remastered. This is more so the style of Metroid Prime 3, essentially a more modern version. The upgrades are pretty obvious. Firstly, the flames coming from the ship are far more realistic. Prime Remastered uses a pretty basic animated texture, something you'd expect to see during the GameCube Wii era. Here in Prime 4, what we see looks more like actual flames shooting out, and they even change size and shape depending on speed. Secondly, the material quality and variety has been vastly improved. We see a much more realistic sheen from the metals, and the variety of different levels of shine on different types of metals and other materials in the ship look impressive. In Remastered, the materials they chose are decent, but not as good, and there is far less variety to the material types. This can even be seen on the windshield, that part of the ship that looks a lot like Samus's visor. It has much more realistic reflection, most likely a cube map, while Remastered just sort of had this white sheen. One final detail to note here is that the light from the ship actually illuminates Samus. In Remastered, this is a simple texture, much like the flames coming from the ship. Moving past the ship, one of the most noticeable upgrades was in geometric detail of the environments. The rocks give a higher poly, craggy look, while debris is scattered across the ground as well when Samus lands. While Prime 1 Remastered definitely had a nice amount of polygons and geometric detail in its environments, they've clearly found a way to ramp that up, and it's evident throughout the trailer. Continuing on brings us to one of the biggest parts of the trailer, not just because it's the first time we've seen Samus in Prime 4, but because of how damn good she looks. Obviously her suit has a redesign, but I noticed that it was made in a way that doesn't clip into itself very often. The suit from Prime 1 Remastered has sort of an impossible dimension to it, so it's constantly clipping. But after slowing down the footage for Prime 4, we couldn't really find any evidence of the same flaw. I think the biggest change, visually, like the ship, the materials are just much more better than Prime. The easiest place to see this is the helmet. Luckily, late in the trailer we do get a close-up and it's a huge improvement. Not only is the helmet far more rounded and higher poly, but the materials here really shine. The difference between the individual metals and then also the glass of the visor looks really good. The visor, while having some transparency like Prime 1 Remastered, also reflects the environment, and you can actually see Silex here in the reflection. It's probably a faked effect for this cutscene, but it's still awesome nonetheless. The material and polygon upgrade goes for the whole model. And looking back at it, if you look in the groove of the shoulder pads, you can see the embedded green lights, which both look much more rounded and higher poly, but you can actually see the green light reflected on Samus's suit. You can also see the green of her visor doing the same. Also looking at her back, and at the back of her helmet, it's obvious to see the different materials, and how much more rounded and filled out the detail in her model is. I think her entire model responds to light in a much more convincing manner. She just fits into the environment more, and lighting on her model is more often consistent with what's around her. She never has this overall glowy look we sometimes see in Prime Remastered. And I'll also just say, just for the overall design of this suit beyond just the graphical effects, this looks like a Samus that is actually a humanoid fitting within this suit. It makes more sense naturally, I would say. And when you factor that on top of just how good it looks, how much more depth we see to the model, and how it fits more naturally with all the lighting effects, it's a pretty sizable improvement, I would say. But on the note of lighting effects, the next big key upgrade we'll be discussing here are fire and explosions. At first I thought I might actually prefer the fire in Prime Remastered, and it has a more bright and punchy look. I mean, Prime 4 just looks a little dull here. But then looking later into the trailer, I saw moments of that bright and punchy look, and I realized Prime 4 isn't duller, it's more dynamic. Prime Remastered has super bright punchy lighting, but that often produces lighting that doesn't look quite right. A lot of the areas seem glowy, and it appears to break the baked lighting that makes Prime Remastered's shading materials look so good. Prime 4, however, doesn't ever have this glowy, disconnected, and floaty appearance. The fire and explosions are grounded much better in the environment and don't look out of place. There are just some moments that look really impressive. Once you see Samus start walking in, and there's that giant purple explosion that flashes across the whole screen in a very believable way, and it just looks awesome. But something else I noticed is that when Samus is shooting her arm cannon, it does light up the environment in different ways, and in a few different scenes. You see, at first I wasn't sure if the arm cannon was lighting things up, but upon closer inspection, I have noticed it happens in a variety of different ways, and more significantly than how it was in Prime Remastered. You see, in the original Prime games, they had a cool little trick where when you would shoot your arm cannon, and you would see the light of the shot travel down hallways. But they were unable to emulate that effect in the exact same one in Prime Remastered, and so the lighting effects with the arm cannon are extremely subdued. You can't use them to light up the environment when it's very dark, for example. But in Prime 4, it looks like they have found a way to make this work to some extent. Now, we don't know if we can use the arm cannon to light up dark areas like we could in the original games, but we are seeing more lighting effects here. So as Samus is approaching the Federation facility, and she is shooting the space pirate at the wall, you can see the light of her beam traveling towards the wall and the space pirate, and you'll see it touching the ground, it illuminating the space pirate right before impact, and the wall itself as these shots pass over. And I noticed this a bit more convincingly when the space pirates came down through the roof in their pods. Once Samus shot her beam cannon at them, right before impact, you'll see that they get lit up by the light of the blast before they're blasted. And so those are some really cool details that they have found a way to make work in this Switch version of Prime 4 Beyond. Another big improvement I noticed was in the resolution and frame rate of large explosions. In Remastered, large explosions, like from the initial ship escape sequence, often ran at a much lower frame rate and resolution than the rest of the game. They looked a little out of place and jarring. In Prime 4, I saw no evidence of a lower frame rate for any explosions, and the resolution of fire and explosions seems much higher. Finally, the smoke from explosions and fire looks a lot more convincing. While smoke in some scenes in Remastered looks decent, others really lacked volume, and often it's easy to see the 2D nature of the effect. In 4, however, they seem to have improved their technique, implementing more smoke and making it look much more convincing as a 3D effect. Additionally, at the end of the trailer, right before we see Silex, we see a large explosion that appears to use volumetric smoke. Now, this is probably a pre-canned effect that is essentially an animation played back in real time for the scene, but it still looks awesome. After, we also see large volumes of smoke rising from the flames around Silex and his party. A cutscene nicety most likely, but still something we didn't see in Prime Remastered. Going back to Samus, let's look at her abilities. We see her use her normal arm cannon shot, as well as a charge shot and missiles, all of which look different from Remastered. The regular shot is mostly very similar, but it has a much softer look to it. The charge shot, however, looks completely different. It's mostly blue once charged and is much more transparent and detailed than Remastered. The shots also appear to be taking up less of the screen, so there's more screen real estate to actually see what's going on in the environment, which I think is an important improvement here. The missiles also look different as well. While Remastered kept a lot of the transparent texture effects with the new ones, Prime 4 goes for a completely dynamic and more real look with smoke trails actually forming behind the missiles as it travels, and a much more realistic explosion upon impact. Another clear change is with Samus' scan visor. While having a completely different scanning animation, it also turns the environment to grayscale while scanning, and highlighting the enemy and anything scannable nearby for a moment in green. The UI seems to focus on blocking your screen less and letting you have a better view of the action while scanning, which is nice, which is appearing to be a common theme here. Moving on, let's now discuss her Morph Ball ability. Two things that appear to be completely new here. Firstly, I noticed that the animation for getting into the Morph Ball seems to be much faster than before. but they also replaced this transparency effect with a really cool lighting one that also lights up her model. At the same time, we get some lovely per pixel motion blur that really accentuates the movement. And personally, I just like the overall choice of design as we see Samus transitioning into Morph Ball and we see the light from the blue lightning spreading across Samus's body as she transforms. It's a really cool effect. Going beyond Samus's abilities, let's now discuss a bit more about the enemies. While the compression and close-up shots in this trailer makes it tough, I think we can see some improvements. Basically, I think we see similar improvements to enemy models as we do with Samus, but maybe not quite as much. Enemies in Remastered look fine, but often very few material types tend to look glowy in many environments that had fairly low texture quality and poly counts when viewed up close. This appears to be greatly enhanced in Prime 4, with the enemies having detailed models with better materials that blend in much better with the environment's lighting. Another small thing I noticed is that the bloodstain from enemies no longer looks like it's floating, and rather than fading away, dead characters sort of disintegrate, which is much cooler. There's also been an improvement to the animation of enemies and Samus herself, especially for cutscenes. In Remastered, they left in animations from the GameCube original, so there's kind of a disconnect between how well everything looks and how well it animates. The original Metroid Prime did come out back in 2002 after all. In Prime 4, however, we see animations that are up there with the fantastic work we saw from Mercury Steam in Metroid Dread. These animations and cutscenes are enhanced with a variety of new post-processing effects we didn't really see in Remastered. Here we have tons of lens flares from bright lights, we have full screen motion blur, and screen shake emphasizing those heavy explosions, as well as per object motion blur like when Samus goes into Morph Ball, or when this bird flies in front of the camera in the forest area, and we have depth of field to really draw our eye to that gorgeous Samus model. That's why everything looks very clear and focused on the target, in this case Samus, and everything behind blurs in a natural way. Overall, I'd say this gives the game much more cinematic flair than Prime Remastered was able to offer. And finally, I wanted to end by talking about the resolution and frame rate of the game. While the game obviously targets 60 frames per second like all Retro Studios titles, and mostly holds it, it actually does drop some frames when Samus is changing into her Morph Ball. However, I fully expect this to be fixed by launch, and I don't think we'll have to worry about many frame drops in the final game. Something else I'd like to note from my initial analysis, and some corrections I'd like to be made, there's been some conversation about the fire effects and maybe even the water effects in this trailer having a lower frame rate to help overall performance. Upon looking at the footage going frame by frame, for the most part, these effects seem to match up frame by frame across 60 frames per second. So that does not appear to be the concession that they are making here to make this game run so well. Maybe the reason there was some confusion about this is because there are some occasional frame drops in the game, but it mostly appears to be across the board when it happens. But it's few and far between, and again, we expect there to be improvements come release. As for resolution, it's more tricky. Since the trailer was so compressed, hardly any frames had enough clarity to count any edges. But I did get two that were good enough for an estimate, and they were around 864 to 900p. This would be impressive as Prime Remastered was a 900p game, but we don't know yet if dynamic resolution is in play or not. I will say that Nintendo World Report reported that they were estimating that the game was running at 720p, but this may have been based off some not fully resolution media. And then Digital Foundry seems to be under the consensus that the game is running under 900p, and from what we've seen of press release screenshots, it's at 900p. So if I had to take a guess, I'm going to assume that like Prime Remastered is running at the same resolution, which is pretty impressive considering how much more ambitious this game is. So overall, Brandon and I are floored by Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. There are some significant visual leaps here. It's clear that Prime Remastered was a stepping stone to what they would accomplish with Prime 4, and it's absolutely special. Retro Studios once again is showing that they are masters of Nintendo hardware, and they are pushing the Switch to the absolute limit. But what do you think? What do you make of the differences between Prime 4 Beyond and Prime Remastered visually? Are you impressed? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.